Started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Vanessa Johnston. I'm the Vice President of the Colorado End of Life Collaborative. And we have a wonderful speaker tonight. Amy Pickett Williams is here from the Light Movement. So I just wanted a couple of housekeeping things first. I'm going to keep letting people in as they come. So this program is being recorded, and this will live on our YouTube channel later on the Colorado End of Life Collaborative YouTube channel. So what we'll do is, as Amy is presenting, we'll stop periodically if anybody has questions or something urgent they want to say. Otherwise, you can wait till the end to ask your questions, particularly if they're of a personal nature. I'll stop the recording before we get to that Q&A session. So if you would rather ask it then you can wait till the end. Otherwise, if you want to drop it in the chat, I'll be moderating the chat. And then, like I said, occasionally Amy will stop and answer questions as well. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm just going to give a quick introduction here just to make sure everybody is in the right place at the right time and on the right webinar. So this is called Growing with Grief, and it's a somatic approach that Amy is going to share with us. And we all know that grief is not something that we get over. We grow with it. So this training explores the science of how grief is held in the body, including nervous system responses and somatic memory. Participants, that's all of you, will learn body-based tools such as breath work, movement, and polyvagal informed techniques to support integration, resilience, and meaningful connection. So there's a lot of different kinds of grief, and we're experiencing a lot of it right now. So we're so thrilled that Amy could bring this information to us. So Amy is a grief psychotherapist, a yoga teacher, and founder of the Light Movement, which she can tell you more about that wonderful organization. With over 25 years of experience supporting individuals and families through loss, including the death of a child, infertility, illness, and identity shifts, she bridges psychotherapy and somatic healing. Amy integrates polyvagal theory, yoga, breathwork, and body-based interventions to help people process and integrate grief. She leads trainings like this one, also retreats, workshops on grief, trauma, and mind-body healing. So we're going to hear all about that. And we are just so excited and happy to have you here, Amy. So I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you. I'm very excited to see all of you either live or with a beautiful photo of each of you. So what I'm going to do during this presentation tonight is start the PowerPoint, but I'll stop the PowerPoint periodically just to check in. For anyone that feels comfortable having their faces on, especially when I stop the PowerPoint, I love that connection and co-regulation, but it's definitely not required. So without further ado, I'll get started on the PowerPoint. Let's see. And Vanessa, can you give a thumbs up? You can see it? Awesome. All right. So again, my name is Amy Pickett Williams. I've been doing this work for over 25 years. What I found in my career, I started out working in oncology and hospice and then into pediatric oncology, moved into community-based, and have had a private practice for many years. And what I found, even though I was trained as a talk therapist over 25 years ago, I've learned over the years to really work with the body when we're experiencing grief. And it's really important to me, every training that I give is I read 2 slides, and they're very important with Light because we are a social justice nonprofit. The land acknowledgement, we acknowledge, at least where I am right here, that our training platform operates on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples. We also acknowledge the ancestral and unceded lands of all locations where our students are located. We honor their enduring relationship with this land and recognize their resilience and contributions to somatic healing. As we connect, we commit to listening, learning, and collaborating with Indigenous communities to foster healing and reconciliation. And our inclusivity statement. Our trainings are dedicated to creating a safe and inclusive environment for all individuals seeking to expand their areas of expertise and gain more knowledge on somatic work. We welcome participants of all backgrounds, cultures, and identities, including but not limited to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, ability, and socioeconomic status. We believe that healing is a collective journey, and we strive to honor diverse perspectives and experiences in our somatic healing practices. We are committed to ensuring that everyone feels seen, heard, and valued as they engage in our workshop sessions. So I'm going to start out with the light movement and how we began. It's the first time I'm going to stop the slideshow and share with you. Any of you that have attended my workshops before, you've heard this story, but I always feel it's really important to share my personal story because we all have our own experiences of grief, and I want to feel like we can connect. So as I shared earlier, I've been doing this for 25 years. My dad was a very important person in my life, and he spoke nationally on mandated reporting, so child abuse reporting. He spoke nationally on keeping schools safe, so preventing school violence. And his last hurrah before he died was to try to ensure transgender youth had safe public restrooms in public schools. He believed all children, no matter their experience of who they were and what they'd been through, deserved to be safe in schools. And my dad would always say to me, Amy, you need to speak to this work that you're doing with grief and loss. And gradually over the years, and this thing called somatic that you've been teaching me about, the mind-body connection. And I always said, Dad, I'm a therapist. I'm an introvert. I do the one-on-one thing. That's not my thing. But I was always inspired by him. He stood 6'5". He was known as a gentle giant, and he was also a very, very humble person. So I was always inspired by him because he would speak nationally, and yet he had this humble experience and aura around him. Well, tragically during COVID, our family, like many, were isolated. We had to be isolated a bit longer than most. My husband and I have 3 children, and our youngest had some pretty severe health issues at that time. And so they could not go to school a lot longer than most kids, for a lot longer than most kids until they were vaccinated. And for any of you that have younger kids, probably remember that younger children could not be vaccinated for quite some time. So the way we coped with that is we would go camping, and we would camp with my parents. They owned an RV. We don't own an RV, but we would camp all over Colorado with them during that time. And there was one very, very windy, gusty day that my dad went to return the RV where they stored it. And unfortunately, as he went to close the gate, a big gust of wind just knocked him over. And he ended up with a brain bleed. And 2 days later, we had to withdraw life support. And it was hard. It was very, very hard for our family. Obviously, COVID was hard for all people. Our experience, that was very unexpected. My dad was quite a role model for my children. Our oldest struggled probably the most. And so during this time, my mom, who had never lived on her own, they'd been married for almost 50 years. While they were both very liberal people, they had a very traditional marriage. And so my mom didn't know how to handle the finances and all the things that he took care of. So all of my time was devoted towards taking care of my mom, my 3 children, my clients. And so I had to put my grief aside, even though I'd been trained for over 20 plus years by that time to work with my grief. But at that moment, I had to contain it. And I'm sure many of you can relate to that. Well, eventually came the day where my kids got vaccinated. My mom was able to cope with her grief. And my mom said to my husband and I, why don't you all go away for a couple days? My parents used to always say we could go away for 3 nights once a year. She said, I can only handle 2 nights with your 3 boys. And so my husband and I went away to Ojo Caliente outside Taos, New Mexico. I see a few nods. And it's a beautiful place for those that have been, and they know that. And maybe some of you have done the very steep hike outside of the Ojo Caliente, just on the edge. It's a steep, steep mesa. And my husband's very into mountaineering and climbing, and he said, let's go for this hike. And so I said, all right, let's go, knowing that going down was going to be a challenge. But we made it up to the top. and there was this beautiful mica mine, and it was full of it looked like shimmering diamonds. And we enjoyed staying up there, and eventually came the time for us to start heading down. And about a third of the way down the mesa, there was this juniper tree strutting out from the path. And being the vegan and the hippie that I am, I held on to that juniper tree. I believed it helped me down. I hugged the tree. My husband, not a vegan and hippie, was like, "Yes, Amy, I'm sure that tree's helped a lot of people." And we continue down the path. And the last section is the steepest part of the path right before you go into the Ojo Caliente. And my husband said, "Do you want me to lead this hike?" And it happened to be my birthday that day. And being an Aries, born in March and stubborn, I said, "No, I'm leading this hike." And so I took a couple steps. And unfortunately, I tripped and I fell over 40 feet. I ended up with 600 cactus spines, a fractured tibia. The only thing I remember about the fall is hitting my head very, very intensely and terrified that I would die how my dad did. But eventually I came to a stop, but I should not have come to a stop. I actually should have fallen 100 feet, and I should have, in many ways, should have died. But miraculously, another juniper tree stopped my fall. So the juniper tree is now my spirit tree. We rushed to the hospital, and to make a long story short, they said, "You'll be pulling cactus spines out for the next year of your life." And eventually they said to my husband, "You can go get the car and go home. You can take care of your tibia when you get back to Denver." It was an incomplete fracture, so there was an urgency. And my husband went to get the car, and when he came back into the waiting room, I had fully passed out. And my husband, poor husband, thought now twice in the same day that his wife had died. So they readmit me, and they said maybe she has a belly bleed, because they had scanned like every part of my body, but not my belly. And I did not have a belly bleed, fortunately, but they found a mass in my belly. It turns out that I had cancer. So the juniper tree, some people say the cactus spines, but I like to say the juniper tree, saved my life twice. So now, in the midst of my recovery, I had to slow down. I had to stop seeing clients. My kids were finally back in school. My mom was being able to care for her own self a lot more and take care of her grief. I was able to finally do my grief. And during that grieving process, which was the summer of 2023, I believe my dad's voice came to me, and he said, "This is your time to speak, and this is your time to teach." And so in September of 2023, a group of volunteers and I got together, and we formed on the winter solstice a night to illuminate grief. It was a chance to teach some of what you will learn today. You'll actually learn more than what everyone learned that day, and about the mind, body, spirit connection. And then we brought faith representatives together of every religion we could possibly do. And not Light Movement is not a religious organization, but we believed bringing these faith representatives together would support the notion of standing in solidarity of grief. At that time, many of you remember, and obviously it continues, but it was very intense at that time, Gaza and Israel. And the most beautiful thing that happened is we had rabbis, we had Muslim representatives, we had Native Americans, Christians, um, Buddhists, all come together, and plus many more, to say we have to stand in solidarity. And at that time, we formed our 4 goals of Light Movement. Light stands for love and grief held together. There's always love or attachment in grief. We'll speak to that tonight. And that held together fits with that love and grief, but it also fits with connection and co-regulation of each other. Part of also polyvagal theory, and as you all know, part of working with grief. And so our 4 goals are to remind people they're not alone in their grief, to teach the science of grief and the somatic mind-body based tools to support integration and finding purpose, to connect with other resources like we're doing tonight, because there's so many other resources to support people in their grief. And the 4th is to stand in solidarity for all people and all types of grief and loss, all from a social justice lens. What that means is we're fully inclusive. And it also means that as we teach these tools, we hope that other communities and cultures will morph what we're teaching them to what works in their culture. An example I always like to give is we have a volunteer in Nigeria, and she said, in the genocides that my country has experienced, something that we do is we sing. And is that something we can do? And with somatic tools, as many of you know, anything that's body-based is a somatic tool. So we supported her in bringing that into her culture. So since then, we decided to form a nonprofit, and the nonprofit, I see it in the chat. That is correct. That is our nonprofit. We're updating our website, so there's a few things that aren't working on it right now. But we are all currently volunteers. And we have a lot of interns. We have graduate students and undergrad students, and our goal is to form many different somatic classes. We have some already. Our goal is virtually, and I'll speak a little more to all of our offerings at the end tonight. But I want to definitely get back into the presentation now. And then one other thing I'll say, and this is important, so a couple things I'll say about this slide. This is you all heard my story, but I think it's important to note that we all have our stories of grief, and so we are all faces of light. This painting and a couple of the other paintings in our presentation were done by a 16-year-old girl who found somatic healing in her artwork. Her best friend died of brain cancer when he was 16, and then she made some of our paintings for light. I shared with you already our goal. This is another one of her paintings. This was our original logo for Light. We now actually have a new brand. It's not in this presentation, but we keep this logo and this painting in many of our offerings. Her mom, why it says Hubbard and Hubbard, is some of the tools you guys will learn tonight were drawn by her mom. So what is somatic? So soma means a living organism in its wholeness. It's mind, body, and for some, it's mind, body, spirit, or soul. It is a systems perspective and it embodies all three of them. There are obviously many, many different types of loss. I'd love to stop sharing for a moment. And I always like to ask people, what are the different types of losses that you have experienced or people you have known have experienced? The obvious, I know many of you are likely death doulas, is the loss of a human or maybe a pet. But what are some of the other losses people have experienced? And feel free to put them in the chat and Vanessa will say them out loud too if you don't want to speak them, and we'll go from there.
I had one.
Mhm.
Um, Aside from experiencing two major deaths this year, I have a new one that is not death, but it's a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes of one of my young grandchildren. She's only 5. And
Mhm.
so I didn't realize that would be such a grief process, but it is, especially for the
Yeah,
parents. So I'm kind
absolutely.
of grieving with them.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That was
Mhm.
Anne, yeah?
Yeah. Sorry, my picture's not up. I don't know how to do it.
That's okay. That's okay. Absolutely. There's a lot of grief with a chronic illness like that. I'll share a little antidote story. And then I'll let Vanessa share. I know there's some in the chats. About 9 months ago or so, I spoke at Windcrest with a Parkinson's group. So it was all Parkinson's patients and their caregivers. And I had a few people come up to me at the end and say, I almost didn't come to your workshop. There were about 70 people there. And they said, because we haven't experienced grief. And I thought to myself, huh. Well, they said, well, we haven't experienced someone that has died that's close to us, but we realized after this workshop that we all are experiencing loss. And so it's a lot of times it's that education piece, right? That it's not only the death, but the loss of health, the caregivers recognizing that their partner potentially isn't able to do the same things that they have. So, Vanessa, do you want to read off some of the ones in the chat? Or all
Sure.
of them?
Yeah. So we've got security, love, health, miscarriage, friendships, loss of a life situation, job, family, home, divorce, sense of safety. Father divorced my mom when I was 3, loss of community, and children moving away.
Mhm. Nice job, you guys. You did a good job of covering that. And obviously, there's so many more. But part of what our nonprofit really believes in is supporting all people through all these different types of loss. Back to sharing. So within the different types of loss, there's also different types of grief. And for sake of time, I won't go into these with great detail, but I think it's important to list them, many of the most common ones. Ambiguous grief is that lack of closure, such as emotionally absent. So when someone potentially is no longer interested in their partner, someone that's been lost but hasn't died, has moved away. There's many different examples of ambiguous grief. Abrupt grief is obviously that sudden loss of someone. Anticipatory, many of you probably deal with that are death doulas, that idea that you know that that person will die. Disenfranchised is not socially acknowledged. Back in sadly, in the AIDS epidemic, or pandemic, we saw that a lot. But other examples of that can be when someone has an affair and there's that loss. There's many different examples where it's just not usually socially acknowledged, but it really needs to be. Non-finite, living loss such as chronic illness, or non-finite, I always forget how to say that. Cumulative grief, so grief after grief after grief. I think many of us experience that regularly. It feels like it will never end. Sometimes we say they come in threes. Collective grief is obviously what many of us in our country are experiencing and world right now. That idea that so many of us have that loss. Absent or delayed grief is that example of where maybe you're not ready to quite grieve that experience yet. Climate grief obviously is around our environment. Parasocial, that was actually termed by Mary Frances O'Connor, who's an incredible, done incredible work around grief. She's written the book Grieving Body and Grieving Brain. Grieving Body's her new one. And parasocial is when someone famous dies, whether it's a musician or an actor or actress. Inhibitive is avoidance of the loss. And prolonged grief disorder or complex grief is in the DSM-5. And for any of you that might be mental health professionals, I do a lot of trainings to therapists. I personally really struggle with this. And in my private practice, I rarely need to give diagnoses, but when I do for insurance purposes, I actually avoid this one because I don't like to ever think of grief as a disorder. So I tend to give the diagnosis of adjustment disorder because I don't feel like anyone has a disorder when they are grieving. The whole term of prolonged grief disorder is that if kids are grieving after 6 months or people are grieving after a year, they can be diagnosed with that. And I just don't personally believe in that. Way back when I went to grad school in the 90s, interestingly, if people were grieving after about 6 months, they could be diagnosed with a major depressive disorder. And I personally really struggled with that. We do know that there are many people that can experience a major depression with grief, but there's not always grief with that depression. So I want to take just a moment and identify triggers and glimmers. What we know about grief is that anytime we are triggered by grief, it's triggered by the 5 senses. So we may see something that reminds us of the loss. We may smell or hear or taste. There's so many different ones. But it's also important to note that we also experience glimmers, those moments of hope. Deb Dana, who has worked with Dr. Stephen Porges, who came up with the term polyvagal theory, has coined that term glimmers. And I think it's important to note that when we experience such loss and we're experiencing loss, we can still find those glimmers outside. And those are also found by the 5 senses. So I'd like to invite everyone to just do a little exercise with me. If you feel comfortable, light movement is trauma informed. So if you're not comfortable with doing the exercise, you don't need to. And you can always modify it. So for those that would like to close their eyes or gaze down, I invite you to take a nice deep breath in through your nose. And then slowly exhale either mouth or nose, but ensuring the exhale is longer than the inhale. Maybe do that a couple more times. And when you're ready, I invite you to find a place inside your mind that you maybe have been, or maybe a place you've always wanted to go, or a picture that brings you a sense of peace and a place that feels safe. It may be a place outside in nature. It may be a place inside in a cozy room. It may even be a place. I had a little boy I worked with in my private practice where McDonald's was his place. So once you've landed there, I invite you to, in your mind's eye, look around at everything that you see. You may be there by yourself, you may be there with other people or animals. Gently, maybe begin to turn in a circle to see everything around you, in front of you, and behind you. Maybe above you and below you. And if you'd like to add another piece to this, I invite you to place one hand at your heart and the other hand at the other side of your chest, and just slowly begin to tap as we start to move through the rest of the senses. Just gently tapping back and forth. And now I invite you to imagine bringing your hand out in this peaceful place. Can you touch around you? What are the sensations if you're standing or sitting or lying down? What is the temperature on your skin? Continue to breathe about 5 more breaths, just visualizing everything that you can feel around you. And now I invite you to notice what you hear around you in this peaceful place. And it may even be the sound of silence. And lastly, what do you smell and taste? And if it's nothing at all, that's okay too. You're welcome to continue to tap or hold stillness, just a heart hug. And then slowly go through those 5 senses one more time, maybe continuing to tap. And if you noticed your mind starting to wander, that's okay. Just bring it back. And if at any time it was unsettling, just bring yourself back to your breath. And then when you're ready, I invite you to slowly begin to rub your palms of your hands together until you create heat. If you're wearing glasses, you may want to take them off. And then once you've created a little heat, place up your palms on your closed eyelids, deeply breathing in, exhaling even longer. And then maybe begin to gently massage along your eyebrows and your temples. Maybe dropping your fingers to your jaws and gently massaging at your jaws. Maybe
Oh, it looks like we lost Amy there. Not sure what happened. We were all we were all relaxing too much. We lost Amy. Hopefully she'll come back on here in a minute. I'm not sure what happened. Oh, here she is. There you are. We lost you, Amy.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
That's okay. We were all so relaxed. It took us a minute
It's
to,
internet, but
to
you are, I'm on a
realize.
hotspot if there's something weird with net.
Oh, okay.
Sorry
Okay.
about that, guys. Can you can everyone hear me? Hopefully everyone's calm and was taking just a moment to continue to massage your ears. And I will get us back started on slides. Okay. So I was finishing as I lost you guys. I could, it was interesting. I could still see Christine all the way up until the end, but I don't know
Yeah.
how long it took for you guys. I apologize for that. I'm not sure what happened.
Okay.
All right. So let's go back to our presentation. How was that for everyone? Was it give a head thumbs up if that felt good? Yeah, good. All right. That bilateral tapping can help with integrating that peaceful, calm place. Thank you, Vanessa. I love the hearts. That's great. So Earl Grolman says, grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity, the price you pay for love. So why do we grieve? Bowlby and Ainsworth were the theorists on attachment theory. And what they recognized was when we form attachment to something, when that something or someone disappears, we experience that loss. And thus, with our light movement, love and grief held together, one of the reasons we came up with that. I give a lot of larger CE trainings, and we go into a lot more about attachment theory, but many of you have probably had that, even if you took an intro to psychology class in college. And I always love to talk about, is grief exclusive to humans? And the answer is no. Barbara King, I highly recommend if any of you have not seen her TED Talk. She talks about the grief and love in animals. There's a beautiful story of Mama Whale, whose calf died. And she actually carried that baby after it died for about 3 weeks before she was able to part with it. Barbara King has studied that it's not only mammals, but ducks, many different species experience loss. And Dr. Zoe Donaldson did some studies on prairie voles. They are an example of mammals or rodents, I'm not quite sure, that mate for life. And being a vegan, I struggled a little bit with the study because they do study on animals. But what she did was she would bring these voles that were partners together, and then she would separate them and then study them. And then she'd bring them back together, and then she would study and then take them apart. And what she found was the nucleus accumbens in the brain would light up. And that's a place where we feel attachment and bonding. And Mary Frances O'Connor, I mentioned her earlier, wrote The Grieving Brain, and she spoke a lot to the yearning for the other, that need for that connection. I'm sure many of you have experienced so much of the time when we experience an intense loss, we still feel that person is many times or animal is still there. And that is because our brain processes it in that way with that nucleus accumbens and that attachment piece. And as I shared earlier in the presentation, I worked in pediatric oncology for many years, especially earlier in my career. And an interesting thing that I found was kiddos that were diagnosed with osteosarcoma, some of them had to have legs or arms amputated. And of course, all of us have heard of phantom limb pain. So the kids would feel that pain even after their leg or arm was gone. The part that I found so fascinating at my time at Children's Hospital was there were many parents that also felt that pain, that attachment to their child and the pain of their child's leg missing. Parents would report feeling pain in their leg as well as when I worked with them. So there are many grief theories out there, and I'm sure many of you know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross originally studied terminally ill patients, and I might be preaching to the choir with this, but all of her research was on terminally ill patients. Unfortunately, people then took her research and decided to apply it to those that were grieving and the bereaved afterwards, but that was never her study. So the stages of grief did apply to some terminally ill patients, but did not apply to those that were grieving. And this is a beautiful example of what most people experience in grief. So I have a lot of credit to Kubler-Ross for bringing grief to the surface, helping us recognize that there are theories about it. And she was correct. It's just other people kind of morphed it. Since then, there have been a lot of other people that have added to the stage theory. But what we really know is that most people do not follow a set order when they're experiencing grief. And then many of you have probably heard of dual processing. It is also a great grief theory where we kind of go back and forth. We pendulate between the loss-oriented grief work and then knowing that we have to tend to everything in our life and how it pendulates back and forth and that challenge. And this is also a great theory. Now, the thing with the stages, which we know stages don't tend to be really helpful with people, and what we know about dual processing and many of the other theories is there is a big missing piece, and that is the work with the body. And then Lois Tonkin, some of you have seen this. Apparently, it's been on social media some. And she wrote one article back in 1996. And at Light Movement, we actually really appreciate her work and why many of our presentations are called Growing with Grief. The whole idea is what she said, and she learned this actually from a client she was working with who had experienced the death of a child, is that that client said that my grief never shrinks. It's just ultimately I learned to grow around it. I grow from it. And so as you can see from these circles, the grief circle stays the same. It's just the person begins to be able to grow emotionally around the experience. And going back to that painting I showed you earlier, here's an example that we like to use with Light Movement that was done by the 16-year-old. There's a scar on the cactus, there's a hole in the tree, and what we know is that scar does not ever shrink, but sometimes we can, hopefully, we can continue to grow around the experience. And this question is asked of me a lot. Is grief always traumatic? And the answer is often, but not always. There is always grief and trauma, but there is not always trauma and grief. And the part that's important to note is that when we experience trauma, it's when our nervous system gets stuck in that sympathetic state or that dorsal state, which I'll go into a little bit later. But sometimes with grief, we don't get stuck. We go through the experience and there's highs and there's lows, but it goes up and it goes down and we don't stay stuck in one spot or the other. And the 90-second rule, Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor spoke to this, and it's probably been the number one thing that my clients, especially families who have experienced the death of a child, have held on to and even come back to me years later. I have a lot of clients in my psychotherapy practice that will see me for about a year after an intense loss and then come back when anniversaries come or different triggers come. And Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor said in her work, if we allow ourselves to truly experience that grief moment, it will last in our brains and our bodies about 90 seconds, and then it will dissipate. That's not to say that we're not going to have more waves. There's no stillness in the ocean, but there is always a calm between every wave. So much of the time in our grief, though, we don't allow ourselves to feel that 90 seconds, and then we can get kind of stuck for a long time in our grief. And Viktor Frankl, many of you know, he survived the Holocaust and was a psychologist, and he actually speaks to this in his quote, "Between the stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." I'm going to move a little more into the science of grief, and then we're going to get to some tools to support you all on your journeys and those that you might work with. So this is a very simplistic picture of the triune brain, the three-part brain. There's the neocortex, which is in many ways that governs language. It's what we think of our prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain. There's the limbic brain, which is where we hold our emotions and that attachment piece. And then obviously the reptilian brain that many of you have heard of, which is that fight flight. It's the breathing response. It's what all living beings have, even including lizards that maybe don't have those other parts to their body, to their brains. And I really like to speak to that limbic system, the emotional brain, and the couple parts to it.
Uh-oh, Amy, you're frozen again. Well, it says she's here. I see her name on her little box, but there's no picture or audio.
Can you hear me?
There you are. Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. So then within the hypothalamus, when we experience stress or trauma, it releases CRH, the cortico, I can never say it. We'll call it CRH. It's a hormone. And it connects then to the pituitary gland, which then releases another hormone, the ACTH, which then connects to the adrenal glands, which release cortisol, which then connect back up to the brain. When we experience trauma, what can happen is that we continue to release cortisol, so much so that we get such high cortisol levels. And unfortunately, that can contribute to, I just think this is a cute picture of an owl, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, infectious disease, and many others. I'm not going to say that it is, it causes it, but it is important to know that it can contribute to some of these diseases. So I'd like to take a moment with hopefully our internet still working, and I'm going to invite everyone to gently close their eyes or gaze down and begin to take a few breaths. And I invite you to start with the top of your head. And if you feel comfortable, bring up a loss that you've experienced. It does not need to be a very significant one, or it can be. It's your choice. And we'll slowly work our way through our bodies. And I'll just guide us down through to our toes and notice if there's any sensations come up as you're remembering that loss. So starting at the top of your head, I invite you to take a moment and notice any sensations that come up. Are you noticing any tightness? Any pain? And then slowly begin to work your way down through your eyes, in your jaw. Noticing any sensations that come up as you're embodying the loss that you've experienced. And we'll continue to work our way down to our neck and our shoulders. And at any moment, you may want some micro movements to move as you're experiencing any sensations in your body. And moving down to back and chest. Maybe your arms and fingers and hands. And then slowly continuing down your mid back and your belly. Your lower belly. Your thighs. Your knees, your calves. And ankles and feet and toes. And do one more scan, working your way up at your own pace from your toes up to your top of your head, noticing any sensations that come up. This time noticing if any colors come up inside your body, of where you've experienced sensations of loss. Maybe shapes, maybe a temperature change. And then when you're ready, I'll stop the screen share. And I'd love for anyone to share where you've noticed any sensations inside your body. Feel free to share it in the chat or speak out loud. Chest and arms, helplessness.
My belly feels really warm.
Feels really warm.
Yeah.
Anyone else like to share? I know for me, after my dad died, I had a lot of migraines. I felt it a lot in my head. Someone shares back of neck, ears, lower back pain and stiffness. Does anyone feel it in their throat? Like they don't have a voice? Mm. Tight jaw. Yeah. Those are all some really good examples, and I'm sure there's many, many more. Go back to sharing the screen. So what we know about the body in regards to how we grow with our grief, at Light Movement, we don't like to say we heal from grief. There's healing properties, but we're not necessarily healed from our grief. What we know is midline in our bodies, there's an endocrine system, which is greatly impacted by grief. There's the vagus nerve, which I'm going to speak quite a bit to. And then from an Eastern philosophy, there's the chakras. And the interesting thing is they're all midline. And many times they're very connected with how they work. And this drawing was done by the mom of the 16-year-old, and I just love what she came up with to show all those midline pieces. The vagus nerve, the endocrine system, and the chakras, all midline in the body. Now, the vagus nerve, I'm sure some of you have heard of, is the 10th cranial nerve, and it runs basically from the brainstem, but it connects around also the ears, and it has different nerve endings that connect into the face. So earlier, when we were doing that massage along the face and the ears, it's a way to stimulate the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve runs all the way down to our lowest torso, part of our torso. The interesting thing about the vagus nerve is the communication actually happens brain to body about 20% of the time and body to brain about 80% of the time. So we know with communication is we actually have to work within our bodies in order to work with our grief. And Dr. Stephen Porges, I mentioned him earlier, with Deb Dana being the person that he works with, who came up with the term of glimmers, came up with the idea of polyvagal theory. And within our autonomic nervous system, there's the idea that things get pathetic.
I think you're frozen, Amy.
A good example of that is Goldilocks and the Three Bears. The bed is too hard, the bed is too soft, and the bed is just right. And Dr. Daniel Siegel came up with something called the window of tolerance, and then Dr. Stephen Porges really tried to expand it on it quite a bit. There's the idea that we are in that sympathetic state, which is that fight, flight, and can be considered freeze response. Freeze is when you're in that intense moment state. And then you're in your balance state, which Dr. Stephen Porges calls ventral vagal. And then there's that dorsal state, which is also a frozen state. It's also a parasympathetic state. So the balance state is parasympathetic and dorsal is parasympathetic. So it's not to say that sympathetic or dorsal is bad or versus good. They're all nervous system states we all experience regularly in our lifetime. But when we're in that sympathetic state, we're outside of that window of regulation. So it could be considered balanced, or like I said, ventral vagal for Dr. Stephen Porges, peaceful, that safe place. And then there's two subset levels. There's the playful area, which is part balanced that leads into the sympathetic where we play. So many of us as adults need to continue to play. And then there's between balanced and dorsal is intimacy. And that's not just sexual intimacy, but that's also nursing. That's connecting with a dear friend or holding a pet. So with that green line that you all see, we constantly ride a little bit of a roller coaster within our window of tolerance. Nothing is ever flat. Sometimes that window in grief, that green line, can go up to the sympathetic and then down to the sympathetic or down to the dorsal. But notice it's a smooth kind of roller coaster. What happens when we experience traumatic grief, you can see that black line is it's very rigid and it goes up and down and all over the place constantly. That's that traumatic grief that we all have experienced, I'm sure. So part of the work with light movement and with my work as a therapist is teaching people not only how to get back into that window, that balanced state, but also how we expand that window. So sometimes when I'm working with therapy clients and they come and see me, their window is the size of a little mouse window or a doll window. And what happens is they're constantly outside of it. They can't think right. Their prefrontal cortex isn't functioning well. They may feel like they are unable to get out of bed. And so part of the work is not only teaching tools to get them into that window, but even when we're not experiencing grief, what do we do to make our windows bigger to that sliding glass door? That's why so many of these somatic tools that I'll be speaking to are important to use not only when we are in that intense grief state or trauma state, but also those everyday moments. And then Amy Weintraub, she wrote a couple books, Yoga for Therapists, Yoga for Depressions. I love what she talks about with meeting the mood. What that means is that if we're working with someone and they are in that dorsal state where you can barely get them out of bed, the last thing you're going to suggest is to go for a walk. They're probably going to say, absolutely not. So in those moments, that might be maybe doing a little breathing practice with them, and I'll teach you a few tonight. Now, if someone is in that really intense sympathetic state, or in yoga we call rajasic state, the last thing you're going to suggest is a meditation, right? Because they're going to say, no way am I going to sit down and just do a meditation. That would be the patient where you go for a fast walk, or a client that you go for a fast walk with. You get them moving, you get them doing some shaking and dancing around. So it's so important to really pay attention to yourself when you're in those states, and also the people you might be working with. So there's many key aspects to somatic work. I'm going to speak to 3 this evening: the contraction and expansion, the pendulation of them, bilateral movements, and vagus nerve stimulation. And Rumi, I love this quote. I believe he was a somatic therapist. He just didn't know it because we didn't call it that back then. But he says, your hand opens and closes and opens and closes. If it were always a fist or always stretched open, you would be paralyzed. Your deepest presence is in every small contracting and expanding, the two as beautifully balanced and coordinated as bird wings. So notice it's we're not, the hand opens and closes and it doesn't stay stuck. As I spoke about earlier, right? We get stuck sometimes in that sympathetic state or that dorsal state. That's that traumatic grief. But if we're constantly pendulating back and forth, we can work with our grief and grow with our grief. So I invite you, for those that would like, to practice a few of these. The contraction and expansion, when I teach these yoga classes, you can bring your elbows parallel to your shoulders, fingertips reaching to the sky, really pushing your shoulder blades together as you breathe in. And then slowly exhaling, bringing forearms together, palms together, head towards those elbows. And then at your own pace and own rhythm, expanding out, breathing in and contracting in. Continue to do that a few times at your own pace and rhythm. And I'll speak a little to it maybe as you're doing this. We expand out into our vulnerability to say, this is what's happened to me, to really own the grief and work with the grief. And then we contract in when we say we're not quite ready. But it's that both are important in the grieving process. That pendulating between the two is so important, and not getting stuck. Now, the vagus nerve, if we stimulate the vagus nerve, what we know is it can help us get back into that parasympathetic response, that balanced dorsal ventral vagal state. So humming is a beautiful way of doing that, because when we hum, we have a longer exhale, right? We also know the vibration stimulating that vagus nerve helps us get into that ventral vagal balance state. One beautiful yoga therapy or yoga technique that some of you maybe have done is humming bee's breath. I'm going to teach you. If anyone would like to participate, you're going to place your second finger on your eyebrows. Your middle finger will go on your closed eyelids, but not yet, because you want to be able to see where my other fingers go. Your fourth fingers will go on each side of your nose, your pinky fingers on each side of your lips, and then your thumbs will block your ears, and you'll hear only yourself. I promise you that I will speak loud enough to where you'll hear me when I say, okay, but we'll go for about 30 seconds. What I'm going to encourage you to do is to hum Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or Mary Had a Little Lamb, and find the vibration for you tonight that feels most soothing. For some people, it might be higher up. It might be like, hmm, 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 hmm. For some, it might be low, and for some, it might be in the middle. So I'm going to encourage everyone to do this. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Everyone is muted, so you won't hear anyone. But then I'm going to ask a few questions. So feel free to just play for a little bit. Nice job, everyone. Nice job. Would anyone like to share either out loud or in the comments? Was a lower tone more soothing for you, a mid tone, or a higher pitch or tone? Lower for someone?
Lower was better for me. Yeah.
Or, okay. Anyone else want to share?
Hands
Lower.
is lower. Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
I actually found the higher tone and going in between the tones very
Mhm.
soothing, very,
Nice.
very soothing and relaxing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? It's interesting. When I give this workshop, I get everyone has a different experience. Well, not everyone, but what I see is there's some that are in high, some that are mid, some that are in low. I'm always curious at what time I give this presentation. Interestingly, I tend to see a little bit lower in the evenings, and I tend to see mid-range or higher in the mornings. That's just an interesting tidbit, and I don't know if there's a connection or not. So.
Somebody should research that.
Somebody should. Yes. Yes. Someone might get famous for that. All right. Let me go back to sharing the screen. So straw breath is a nice one also, or pinwheel breath, that allows for that longer exhale. Interestingly, different yogis have different philosophies on this. One of my mentors says, never have your mouth open when you exhale. And then some yogis say it doesn't really matter. It's just the longer exhale will help stimulate that parasympathetic response. For little children, if you're working with children, you can do the 5 birthday candles. So you slowly breathe in and then slowly breathe out. With children, it's fun to say if you blow too quickly, the candle will blow out. So it teaches them to say, let it flicker, and then eventually it'll go out. So this is another beautiful tool, your choice on whether or not you let it go. You inhale through your nose and then exhale through your nose or exhale through your mouth. Straw breath is helpful for people that struggle with that longer exhale when breathing through their nose. So it does allow to if you pierce your lips like this, it allows for that longer exhale. And humming, obviously, what I shared earlier is a longer exhale as well. Before the internet cut out the first time, I was having you guys massage your ears, but we'll go through this again because I think this is really important. What we know is there are nerve endings that connect to the vagus nerve that go within our ears. The tragus, which is that flap right in front of the ears, you can gently pinch that and just gently massage along both sides, the in and the out. And then the concha is that shell shape just outside the ear canal. And this is another great place to gently massage. Sometimes I like to tease people and say, you're never supposed to stick Q-tips in your ears, although some of us have done that. And why? And it feels really kind of good. Well, the reason for that is because of those nerve endings connecting to that vagus nerve. I am not telling anyone to leave here tonight to stick Q-tips in their ears, though. Just want to make that clear. And then acupressure points. There are so many different acupressure points that can help with grief and with trauma. One really soothing one, if people want to try, is run your fingertips along your collarbone, right to the edge of the shoulder. Sometimes it can help to just kind of move your arm around a little bit. And then go back a little bit towards the mid chest, just a tiny bit, about an inch, and then drop below. You will find a tender point. Most acupressure points are tender points in the body. And once you find it, you can just gently massage along it. For everyone, it's a little different. Just finding it, and then you're welcome to try the other side as well. And then hand points, some of us get motion sickness. So many of us know mid wrist is a nice place for when we're feeling motion sick. Just on the side by the thumb, once again, trying to find that pressure point. So if you go down along your thumb ridge into the wrist, just gently massaging, you'll find
Amy, you're frozen again. We missed that. You were frozen a little bit.
I don't know.
Oh, there you
Can
go.
Okay, so
Yeah,
just
you were explaining the thumb.
Yep. So just go down the thumb line to the wrist, and then you'll find a tender spot. And you can gently massage there.
And I think Christine had a question on the first graphic there. Is that lung 1?
Yes.
Point.
Mhm. The lung is one of the main areas for acupuncture where we hold our grief. And then self-havening. This is a great one if you are experiencing, or a client or patient is experiencing, that dorsal state. So just gently massaging, giving yourself a hug up and down your arms, just gently massaging along your arms, your belly, and your legs. And then if people are in that rajasic sympathetic state, dancing or shaking can be really helpful in those moments. As this is the evening time, I won't ask everyone to get up and get super hyper. This is what I do in my morning programs, but you're welcome to if you would like. But just to shake your body, you can even in your chair, just shake your hands. You can like kind of tap things, not the self-havening is very gentle, but you can also just kind of shake it off this way, pull it off, push it off. And obviously, these are different tools and techniques that I've learned in my yoga training, but it's so important to note that there are so many somatic tools out there. Swimming, yoga, hiking, dancing, gardening, baking. They utilize both sides of the body. They utilize that contraction and that expansion. One little girl that I'm working with right now is a competitive swimmer, and I was talking with her the other day about this, and she's like, "Oh, Amy, swimming uses all three of those." And I said, "Tell me how," knowing full well, because I'm a competitive swimmer and my oldest son is a big competitive swimmer, but I wanted to hear her say it. She's like, "Well, you use both sides of the body always with swimming." And then she said, and contraction and expansion, breaststroke is my favorite stroke. So you're going out and in. And then the breathing, you hold your breath briefly, you know, and then you slowly breathe it out as you're doing, like, for example, the freestyle. I was very proud of her for saying that. And then there's drumming, there's journaling, there's pottery, singing, painting, all of those use those bilateral movements or contraction expansion or vagus nerve stimulation or a combination of all three. And earthing and grounding, there's a lot of really interesting research out there on the electromagnetic waves of the earth, how they are balanced, and our technology, like our phones, are not balanced. And so just going outside, whether you believe in that or not, but going outside in nature helps us ground, helps us find those five senses as we work with our grief. And then going back to polyvagal theory, that ventral vagal state is part of that co-regulation and connection with others. I know I'm preaching to the choir with all of you who know this, but that is the number one way to work with grief is co-regulation and connection with others, whether they're humans or pets, or as you can see in the little picture, even a lizard. And then holding space for each other, connecting, number one way to work with our grief. Animal assisted therapy actually is a somatic tool as well. I always love to share this in workshops. I had a therapy dog for many years. There's a great tool you can use with dogs that are about this size and that aren't puppies. You can place your arm around them and sit side by side, and your breath and your dog's breath, or the dog you're with, will start co-regulating and connecting to the same rhythm. If you have a smaller dog or a cat, not a kitten, or not a puppy, because they tend to have a faster breath, you can also put them on your belly and you guys will co-regulate and connect. It's a beautiful tool with our animal friends. And then meeting the basics. I mean, obviously we all know this, but I always like to really make sure people understand why this is so important when we talk to others or when we're experiencing grief ourselves. So much of the time we don't eat when we're experiencing grief, and our blood sugars will drop, and that can mirror that dorsal state, that dead to the world state. Or we just grab anything, such as a candy bar. And what can happen is when we're not in a traumatic or grief state, we get that sugar high, we're excited, we're happy, and then we drop down, and then we're like, ugh. When we're experiencing grief, though, that sugar high can actually mirror what feels like anxiety. And so I always encourage people to get like dried nuts and fruit, or if they eat meat, a meat and a cracker, hummus and apples, really trying about every 3 hours to keep their blood sugars balanced. Sleep is obviously really a struggle for people that are experiencing grief. There's a lot of different breathing techniques that can be really helpful for that. Obviously, finding a sleep hygiene routine is really important. Sometimes people will turn to medication, and that can be helpful for a short period of time. But I really encourage that not to go long lasting, because what will happen is that our bodies will grow accustomed to that, and then it will be much harder to find a sleep cycle that's healthy. And then exercise, even if it's a 20-minute walk every day or something that allows ourselves to feel more grounded. I do want to speak a little to psychopharmacology. At Light Movement and as a therapist, I 100% believe that there are times when people need medication, when that grief there's also depression, or there's also post-traumatic stress, or there's also anxiety, or they came with something before. It's 100% necessary at times for people. So I don't want to negate that at all. These are just added tools that can support people. So many of you know this, but I always like to have this slide out there, and then I'm going to stop the share for a moment. The things not to say. Comparing, I have some advice about. At least, I think the hardest one I've ever heard is, well, at least you have another child or more kids. Focus on the bright side. They're in a better place. You can always have more kids. You can always remarry. I understand, because no one truly understands, even if you've had a similar experience. I know how you feel. You're handling this better than I expected. It's not that bad. You're not over it yet. And then the things to say, and then I'm going to stop the screen, and I'd love to hear if anyone has examples of either. I am so sorry. This one could be a mixed bag, as some of you may know. Sometimes people want to hear that, and sometimes they don't. If you would like to tell me about, I would love to know more. I would love to just sit with you if you would like. You do not need to say anything. Grief has no expiration date. Whatever you are feeling is okay. There are no words. You are not going crazy, and I'll continue to check in and mean it. I always say one of the best things about technology is that we have smartphones. So for anniversaries, I always encourage people to put that anniversary in for friends that have experienced the loss. So every year they're checking in with them, because as you all know, many people forget after that first year or year or two. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. Are there any things that people have said or that have been helpful or have been very unhelpful?
I think for me, helpful is around grief when people ask me, how's your heart doing?
Mhm. Mhm.
It really takes you, to a much deeper place.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because you
Absolutely.
have to check in,
Mm,
to what you truly are experiencing in the moment.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful one and very somatically based too.
It is, totally.
Mhm,
Yeah,
mhm.
thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else want to share? Yeah.
Yeah. I think a situation of suicide came up, and like just being able to identify if you were blindsided in some way, just trying to get the emotional term in a way people can say, I'm angry, I'm confused, there were no signs, like just identifying that emotion, but also just after hearing this great presentation, like where are they feeling that? Yeah.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Complex type of grief. And yeah,
Mhm,
yeah.
mhm. Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else want to share?
Sometimes when I talk to people who are grieving, I ask the name of their loved one because they part of the grief process is that they don't get to talk about that person anymore, you know,
Mhm,
and they don't get to say that name out loud anymore. And
mhm.
so just asking, if it's a lost situation like that, what was your loved one's name? Tell me about them,
Mhm.
giving them that opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I I lost my husband 9 months ago, and I really appreciated a friend who was in town, who I don't see all the time, asking if after everything has settled down, have people just kind of left you alone or just not acknowledge that you would still be grieving hard,
Mhm,
say a few months later or something. And it does feel like sometimes people think you're gonna be okay after a few months, even though you have to be out there doing what you need to do. But I
mm,
really appreciated him acknowledging that. I said, yeah, you're right. It really does happen that way.
mhm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
Okay, I'll go back to our So obviously within Light Movement, we offer those somatic tools, but there are so many other resources out there. We partner and collaborate with Heartlight on a regular basis. There's support groups. For some, their faith tradition is really important. I give presentations sometimes to religious representatives or leaders. And in reality, every religious ritual is somatically based, whether it's mala beads or rosary beads, standing up, sitting down for prayer, singing. So many of the rituals that faith representatives utilize are, I think actually all of them have a somatic part to them. And I always want to honor Elizabeth Kubler-Ross because she didn't know her work was going to end up changing to the way that wasn't necessarily helpful for people. She says the most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and a deep, loving concern. So once we've utilized these tools, we've maybe connected with others, we work towards integrating our grief, integrating our experiences within our bodies. And once we've been able to do that, we can then move towards meaning making and finding purpose. And again, it's important to say that we don't believe in Light Movement that things happen for a reason. But what we do believe is what do we do now? For me, as you all heard my story, it was starting the Light Movement. For you, it might be volunteering at your kid's school or at a shelter. It might be becoming a death doula and being part of the end of life care collective. There's so many areas that you can find to find meaning and purpose. One thing I do like to share with everything that's going on, especially in our country right now, so many people, no matter where they stand in their beliefs, are either in that sympathetic state, that fight, flight, freeze response, or in that dorsal, I just give up. There's no point. Well, we cannot promote change when we're outside our window of tolerance. So utilizing these somatic tools can help us get back into our window, which can help us then promote change. And if you're interested in the light movement, we have a lot of areas to support volunteering. You can guide a class, yoga, journaling, dancing, walking, sketching, and so on. We have fundraising areas to continue to promote and support light, and outreach and marketing. So please feel free to reach out if any of those things might interest you. And within our volunteers, for people, we have obviously you reach out for support. We have support time for people that want to volunteer for us, and we're continuing to build our website. One thing we do on our website, we're redoing it, but anyone that does connect with us, we like to put their resources on it, because there are not enough people that help people with grief in this world right now. So we believe in always sharing the love. As a matter of fact, Vanessa was at our Night to Illuminate Grief as one of our resource people. And lastly, I always like to end in this poem. I listed off a couple of my mentors. Another one that is a friend and mentor is Dr. Ariel Schwartz. She had this poem in a class that she was offering right before our first solstice event. And I said, oh my gosh, this is light. So I want to finish with this, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. And it's How the Light Comes by Jan Richardson. I cannot tell you how the light comes. What I know is that it is more ancient than imagining, that it travels across an astounding expanse to reach us, that it loves searching out what is hidden, what is lost, what is forgotten or in peril or in pain, that it has a fondness for the body, for finding its way toward flesh, for tracing the edges of form, for shining forth through the eye, the hand, the heart. I cannot tell you how the light comes, but that it does, that it will, that it works its way into the deepest dark that enfolds you, though it may seem long ages in coming or arrive in a shape you did not foresee. And so may we this day turn ourselves toward it. May we lift our faces to let it find us. May we bend our bodies to follow the arc it makes. May we open and open more and open still to the blessed light that comes. So thank you all so much. And I would love to answer any questions that might have come up.
Beautiful. Thank you. Well, I'm going to stop our recording so we can just have time for those of us that are here. And then we'll go to the question and answer session. Thank you, Amy.